Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Alexander Scott. I am your host and a member of the Latin American Perspectives editorial collective. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Claudia Horn to discuss the September 2025 issue of LAP titled Amazon Rainforest and Socio-Ecological Alternatives in Latin America. Claudia Horn is a lecturer in political economy at King's College London and one of the issue editors. For today's episode, we'll be exploring different ways of thinking about the Amazon and discussing how broader social, political, and economic processes shape everyday life in the region, from questions of development and governance to issues of care, gender, and territory. Without further ado, let's get to the interview. Claudia, welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast.
Thank you. Hello. Pleasure to be here.
So just to start a conversation, could you just briefly describe the main theme of the issue and what was the process for how it came about with you and your co-editors?
I think it started in 2000, at the end of 2023 or in 2024, when, I think pretty much the moment when it was clear that COP30 would be hosted in Belém.
COP30 being the UN climate change conference, right?
Exactly. And of course, it's also curious fact, of course, until pretty much almost the end, there was always this debate, which very much also shows the assumptions about the region being a periphery, being not well organized or things like that, that there was constantly also discussions around, will it really be there? Can it really be there? And really serious discussions also whether it would actually instead happen actually in Rio de Janeiro, where, for instance, the Rio 92, the first climate conference happened in 1992. So when it was announced that it would be in Belém, Felipe approached me and together with Fernando, the three of us, started to work on this. And the theme was socio-ecological alternatives, because that would also respond to this timely debate around the Amazon, but discuss it in a focused but also open way, academically, giving a particular space, of course, to regional authors in the space that is Latin American perspectives, that is critical and allows a critical engagement with this theme of socio-ecological alternatives.
Now, in the introduction, you describe the Amazon as something that almost defies definition, as like an impossible object because of its overwhelming multiplicity. I'm curious, what are the risks of trying to define or fix the Amazon in a single framework, as often happens in kind of common sense discourse about the region? And what does this mean methodologically to instead embrace the multiplicity of the Amazon? I know this is a big question, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this.
When we started this project, of course, we were thinking about different ways of framing this, and also of criteria for making a selection in terms of themes for the issue, and we just felt it was very hard, and also how to frame it. Of course, our reason for doing this issue was the fact that COP30 was going to happen in Belém, in the Amazon, for the first time. which
Right.
really kind of brought attention to the region that usually doesn't get attention, but at the same time, it was also receiving, again, the same kind of attention, the exoticizing descriptions that it usually gets. And so just to give the context about that, and so we were decidedly open also. And to get back to your question is really that, yeah, I mean, of course, normally the Amazon is framed in regards to its biodiversity, its role for carbon sequestration as a carbon stock. There's always talks about tipping points. We see pictures of fires, of deforestation. When I lived in Belém, people were just asking me, did you go to the jungle? So these are like these very normal exoticizing ideas and images that people have, and that are constantly also reproduced in the media, and even by some environmentalist discourses, where the resources are either kind of valorized in monetary terms for like destructive extraction, or for kind of a sort of like pseudo green extraction for the purpose of carbon. So we of course wanted to leave to open the space for regional perspectives, and weren't making any rules of how these should look like. And so now, about the concept of multiplicity, that really also we chose this concept also to offer an alternative way to see the region. So multiplicity in IPE, so we're all kind of from an IPE background, and it means kind of the coexistence of multiple socially distinct societies, but that also interact so in their historical development. So it means, given that the Amazon poses such an epistemological challenge because of the different ways of living, different indigenous cultures, absolutely particular relationship between rural and urban, recent migration, different environmental challenges, of course, and the ecological and climatic diversity, they really defy definition and cannot be captured, we thought, with purely thinking about difference or thinking about different countries, right? Because like thinking about the Pan-Amazon region, even though Brazil has most of the Amazon, but of course, like it is, many countries share the Amazon. And so this multiplicity concept aims to open this debate, because of course we cannot, with the issue, we don't want to cover sort of all of the main themes relevant to the region, but keep it open and start the debate, and because it is also the first one. To take account for the different worldviews that exist, but that also coexist in the space, and also overcome some of the established concepts within national boundaries, but also, in a way that also, contributes to projects of decolonization about the region, about Latin America or the global South more broadly, but also about the region.
So, building off this idea, you note that the Amazon is often framed as either a pristine ecological reserve or a resource frontier to be exploited. And I'm curious, how do these dominant narratives shape policy and intervention in the region? And what do they obscure about the lived realities of Amazonian communities and issues confronting the Amazon?
To give an example, I mean, these kind of views shape policies. Of course, I can mostly talk about the example of Brazil, have shaped policies in a way that policymaking has usually sort of the relationship of the Amazon with the national territory is very specific in the way that policy has usually been made from the outside, from the political and financial economic centers in Brazil over the Amazon. So from, to give, for instance, in the dictatorship, when with the sort of migration program, when there was encouraged migration from the military regime, because the Amazon was sort of seen as a land, as an empty land where people, where sort of agrarian pressures in the Northeast, for instance, could be softened by encouraging people, communities, families to go to the Amazon and start farming there. Many of these families, of course, they didn't find the conditions in order to farm, and so this has also contributed to the land conflicts that exist now. Another example is, of course, policy in making in regards to using the Amazon for the generation of energy, right? So the Amazon is used for the generation of hydro, or for the building of hydroelectric dams such as Belo Monte and Tucuruí, plans that already also started under the dictatorship. Usually also, of course, the characteristic is that these are absolutely non-democratic ways of policy making, and also that don't really respond to the local needs of infrastructure, public services, energy, clean water, sanitation, and so on, but to serve the energy needs of the regional, the economic centers, in the case of Brazil, in the southeast, around Sao Paulo, for the country. And so, for instance, for the example of the Tucuruí Dam, that was completed in the 1980s, the local communities only got proper energy in the 1990s after really mobilizing and organizing, whereas at the same time the urbanization and destruction associated with the building of the dam also caused huge problems in these emerging cities, crime, violence, displacement, of course, of indigenous people. And so, these are some of the examples. So also around, policy being made outside, and this concerns these kind of policies, but also conservation policies. My research has been a lot about that. For example, oftentimes environmental projects, sustainable projects, aren't really conceptualized from within the Amazon, but usually from the outside, and that outside maybe Sao Paulo, but it may also be very much the global north. So, for instance, in my book manuscript, for instance, I describe how the G7 in the 1980s, against the backdrop of the debt crisis in Latin America and Brazil's debt as well, kind of decided to do a pilot program for conservation in the Brazilian Amazon. And they decided to do that in Houston in the US without the presence of Brazil. So the Amazon also being, of course, the example of imperialism and sort of the last frontier of capitalist integration of global South peripheries and natural resources into global capitalism. So these are some of the characteristics of policy making, and then and these repeat, and so, for instance, another example in the case of conservation, for instance, you also see the same ways of territorial ordering and controlling the region, even by establishing certain conservation areas. There is usually the conservationist, as we say, or the biologist assumption that you can build a park, which is very much influenced by the American way of establishing national parks, which either directly leads to displacement of communities, or it simply doesn't recognize that communities live there because they they always live there, even though there is is not a dense population in the Amazon. The Amazon is not without is always without with people, and so most communities in the Amazon are really underserved because of this reality, also because of distances, lack of access to energy, as I said, or infrastructure, and conservation programs and organizations and so on and so forth. Climate finance doesn't address these needs, but it usually addresses the needs of sort of what they say is like global public goods of carbon.
I was just thinking this issue of debt in exchange for ecological resources that kind of comes out of neoliberalization since the 1980s. And since some of our listeners might not be super familiar with that process, if you could just explain what that is, because I find I study neoliberalism and like political and social movements, and I find that really really interesting and depressing and dark. So I would like to hear you explain it a little.
Neoliberalism, yeah, can be defined in various ways, sort of, yeah, either as an ideology of free market and a little state, presumably, or as a sort of project, a political project by elites to reduce, well, a more a state, sort of a bigger state that is more focused on sort of, yeah, controlling and regulating, planning the economy sort of towards market liberalization, and especially also financialization. So financialization defined as sort of the expansion of the financial sector, of financial actors, the increasing power of financial actors, the increasing financial institutions, right? New pension funds, investment funds that have all increased, the increasing establishment, the increasing financial deregulation in countries. So the elimination of capital controls, for instance, the deregulation of banking, which then also fuels the creation of increasing unregulated financial institutions, which started, of course, with the demise of the Bretton Woods system, with the changing, with the floating currency system
Right.
in the 1970s and 80s, which really, yeah, of course, shaped and continues to shape and restricts sort of the autonomy of developing countries over their development paths. Because on the one hand, of course, they are politically independent, democratic, and especially also in the region, right, post-dictatorships have at the same time sort of established democratic systems. In the case of Brazil, for instance, a very progressive constitution with solid environmental protections as well. But at the same time, these processes are in contradiction with global neoliberal developments that have increased the pressure to open markets. In the case of with the debt crisis in the 1980s, of course, also increased the pressure to export commodities and which then also really restricts the possibilities that these countries have for establishing or for industrialization strategies, for instance, because the primary sector or the extractive sector is so important. Primary exports become so important. And in the case of the region, for instance, in Brazil, in Paraguay, the agribusiness sector has also risen and expanded because of that. And really globally, this is accepted as pretty much unchallenged growth model, and very little criticized, because there is a view that this has as if this has sort of allowed these countries to gain economic growth, but this economic growth has actually been extremely volatile. It's extremely dependent on the fluctuations of the market in demand on these commodities, because of the financial boom and bust cycles as well, and the coming and going investment that these countries then are dependent on. And so this growth is very unstable, is oftentimes very much quickly followed by financial and political and economic crisis, and precisely also political crisis because of that.
Sticking with the theme of capital accumulation and global capitalism, and I wish Felipe was here because I know he would have a lot to say on this, but in the issue, you all bring together the multiplicity with a historical materialist perspective, especially drawing on dependency theory in a very LAP sort of fashion that situates the Amazon within the global capitalist economy. And I'm curious how you see the tension between these multiple ways of life and the pressures of global capitalism playing out in the region today.
I think the Amazon is a perfect example for using or for illustrating the issue of dependency. I already talked about the context of debt in the 1980s that really fueled the expansion of agribusiness and commodity extraction, for instance, in Brazil, with absolute effect on sort of this Amazon frontier, and at the same time also influencing models, international models such as debt for nature swaps that were first implemented in the 1980s in Latin America and also in Brazil. They have been deemed absolutely neo-colonial because of course they kind of use nature as a bargain chip. So I think this is being very normalized also, debt for nature swaps that have really seen a resurgence today. But we cannot forget that actually these are again against the backdrop of a global South debt, and where countries, because of this debt, of course, also need to order to get to get foreign currency to export commodities. So Maristela Svampa calls this the commodity consensus, of course, and there's a huge debate around, or a large regional debate around neo-extractivism related to the dependency of the region. And so, well, in my research, this is very important. The question of dependency and also modern forms of dependency, what's also been called international financial subordination, for instance, the concept that looks at dependency the way it is shaped today, because dependency continues to exist. And for instance, also in my manuscript, I rather turn to the concept of international financial subordination also, rather than just dependency, because the Amazon, in the case of Brazil, for example, also shows that there are some shifts in agency with the rise of emerging economies and the challenge to existing powers, right? But at the same time, because of the way the financial system is set up, and global South countries and emerging economies are integrated within it, at the same time it reproduces certain dependencies. So and the Amazon shows that because it is sort of seen as the stock of resources, either the conventional resources of minerals, of land, or novel resources, values that are being turned into new asset classes, such as carbon, such as biodiversity, such as water.
You identify extractivism, and specifically green extractivism and organized crime, as key threats to the Amazon and Amazonian multiplicity. Could you explain how green extractivism operates and why it can be just as harmful, even more insidious than traditional extractive models? And I'd be curious to hear if you have any thoughts on this issue of organized crime infiltrating the region as well.
Yeah, green grabbing, well, I wouldn't say it's worse than land grabbing, but it highlights the same issue of land inequality, and control, and colonial systems of land concentration in Brazil. We don't really have recent statistics, detailed statistics about land holding or agricultural production in Brazil, because the last census, agrarian census, has only been done in 2017, and this has also political reasons. This delay, it was first delayed under Bolsonaro, but it hasn't been done. So, but we can assume that the land concentration has even increased. And so, of course, there is the land or the green grabbing debate when following the global financial crisis. For instance, financial institutions from the global north were increasingly looking for novel assets and investment opportunities in the global south. So there was a great rush for land, and increasingly also land connected to what's been called green grabbing, which is grabbing land under the pretext of sort of sustainable projects, which can be carbon sequestration, agroforestry, but it can also be plantations for eucalyptus, for instance. And so green grabbing, because it continues to be the expropriation of land from communities and displacing. I think what's particularly striking about green grabbing is that, of course, all these concepts around carbon offsets were have been very much always promoted as a way of harmonizing economic growth, but also finally bringing resources to this under-resourced region and bringing direct resources to the communities. And in practice, of course, that also integrates these communities into the international markets. Just that communities don't really receive much from it. Usually, this is completely managed and coordinated by either some consultancy or agency or international NGO, like the Nature Conservancy the Nature Conservancy writes a lot of these laws, for instance, for the region, for payments for ecosystem services, or these kind of carbon projects. So it kind of drafts the frameworks for community consultations and so on and so forth. Oftentimes they are not sufficiently done. There is sufficient data from communities that oftentimes these protocols are not sufficiently followed, that consultations do not really always happen. So oftentimes, and I've in the region of Pará in Brazil, for instance, where I worked and lived for many years, I've heard of several stories, for instance, where communities were offered kind of contracts without really knowing what it was about, without knowing that they would really relinquish their right to the use of the territory for perhaps a decade. And so it kind of exploits not only the land, it also exploits the labor of these communities that, and I think it's perhaps we get to that as well, but when we think about alternative visions, communities that sort of just by themselves preserve nature because it is part of their life, and they are then being exploited, being portrayed as kind of project beneficiaries when they're actually being exploited as sort of ecological care workers, and don't really receive a proper compensation for that. But so there's this contradiction between the promise of these schemes and the processes of green grabbing, the various dimensions of that. There was one thing, of course, that I also thought about is that it's curious how, of course, the national structures in the region result from colonial nation building, but thereby also kind of impede the collaboration among Amazon countries. Mm-hmm. So there is, of course, the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization, ACTO, as the main intergovernmental entity collaborating on the Amazon, but it's actually quite it's not very strong. So even though the countries of the Amazon share the same challenges of organized crime, climate change, extractivism, and so on, in indigenous people, conservation, there could be a greater cooperation, and this is also a result of this region being so much used for national exploitation and being usually planned from the outside and for resource extraction.
Now, beyond this issue of extractivism and green grabbing and potentially the failure of international organizations and institutions to not only preserve and protect the Amazon, but to do so in a way that aligns with the interests of indigenous communities and local communities, your issue highlights the presence of resistance, specifically from indigenous movements and social movements to alternative cosmologies like sumak causa, or buen vivir. What kinds of alternative ways of organizing life and relating to territory emerge from these struggles, and what can they teach us beyond the Amazon?
Thinking about resistance and alternative is really where the concept of multiplicity is very helpful as well, because there are so many the alternatives that exist in the Amazon. Of course, there are multiple, so diverse that they always challenge established concepts. So, for instance, I talked about the difference between production and conservation that we usually have, or in modern society. And it is very much applied, and that is very much also a problem of our existing concepts of tackling the climate crisis, for instance, the environmental crisis. So, for instance, separating spaces of production from conservation, or nature from society, through, for instance, conservation areas next to or separated from farming, from agribusiness farms, for instance, but then actually thereby also sort of establishing a sort of a plantation style of conservation in a way. So with, for instance, traditional family agriculture, you see that there is no separation between production and reproduction, or production and conservation, because production already also includes the reproduction of the soil, of nature, of families, of cultures, of rituals. And this is why it's also always connected: music, artistic styles, family life. So these are, for instance, and this, of course, directly also connects to concepts like buen vivir that are always based and centered around the relationship with nature, and not distinct from it, or in a way of controlling it, mastering it, or establishing sort of a civilized life by controlling nature through technology. Or so I think these existing ways of life and visions are extremely helpful, actually, for building more effective, more inclusive, more localized, more democratic ways of really actually addressing the ecological challenges that we have. It's just that it's precisely, of course, these visions and ways of lives are marginalized because they can't be controlled and integrated into capitalist markets. And well, and another example of how this works, for instance, is that ways of organizing also, I think, in a very interesting example, I wrote once about it, sort of intersectionality in organizing. I participated in a boat campaign along the Tocantins River in protest to the building, or the construction of a waterway. Well, usually to us it doesn't seem very, very unnormal, right? Our rivers already have waterways; it's completely normal. But in the Amazon, of course, there are no waterways, or they are waterways for communities. And if you build a waterway that completely destroys, you have to drain the sediments. They are supposed to be exploded. And so the construction of the Tocantins Araguaia waterway that has been approved, has received a license very controversially, is very much contested by communities who have also not been consulted. But yeah, so, and the way that communities were organizing itself is a way that is completely, is completely different from what we think of as organizing or resistance. Because, for instance, it was a boat tour over 8 days, traveling to riverside communities, speaking to groups of all faith, of different faiths, bringing together youth groups, women groups, different producer groups, bringing together different producers, or like fishers, small farmers, who even and even this trip showed the diversity along this river. So like upstream and downstream, there being completely different ways of producing. And so it was very beautiful to see also the groups interacting. So, and at the time I framed it as an example for intersectional organizing as a contribution to that discussion.
So, turning towards the back end of the issue, the issue ends by centering Amazonian voices, including literary and poetic contributions. And I'm curious, why was it important to include these non-academic forms of knowledge, and how do they challenge conventional ways of studying the region?
Yeah, that was really cool. I kind of had this idea, and I asked whether it was possible to do it. And I'm glad it was, even though it was a bit challenging to include these kind of styles, even in the academic journal style, like in the systems that of academic journal editing. I noticed.
I can relate to that a lot. Yeah, it's surprisingly difficult and a complicated process that can be very annoying. Yeah, I
The
understand.
formatting of a poem it was very different, and there were errors in the beginning. But yeah, to me it was absolutely important to have alternatives way of expressing, if we're already talking about different epistemologies, different concepts. So then also, well, even if we cannot show more diversity, and of course we'll always have challenges because of the hierarchies and the at least we could include non-academic writings. And so first we thought, for instance, we could also include non-academic writers. So we would actually offer them more support in editing. So we would edit their papers, but then we noticed also we didn't have the resources in order to do that. And so we included those poems from artists from Pará. I asked a friend who is an artist from Pará also to sort of curate this together with me, and we did an open call. We sent it around, and then we have Joanison Silva, Jessica de Miranda Matos, Tiago Cazu, and Tiago Batista, who contributed their poems. And then I think it shows the reality quite well, because it shows these themes of memory, of the forest, of rivers, but at the same time also the urban reality. And I mean, I think I kind of have even here this part that we also included in our introduction. Is by Tiago Cazu. It's called Reminder, the poem Reminder, where it says, the Amazon isn't what you want to see, nor is it just what you can see.
Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today, but thank you so much for listening in. The September 2025 issue of LAP, Amazon Rainforest, and Socio-Ecological Alternatives in Latin America is available online through Sage Publishing. Check the show notes for a link to where you can access the issue. To stay up to date on new issues, articles, and podcast episodes from Latin American Perspectives, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or your preferred listening app. If you're a student, academic, or activist interested in Latin America, or simply someone who wants to engage with the most in-depth and well-researched scholarship on Latin American politics, political economy, society, and culture, please consider subscribing to the journal. Annual print subscriptions start at $74, and we offer discounted rates for students and members of the Latin American Studies Association. In a moment marked by the rise of U.S. imperialism, right-wing authoritarianism, the erosion of independent publishing, and the broader decline of print and academic media, supporting journals like Latin American Perspectives is more important than ever. Your subscription helps sustain a critical space for internationalist, anti-capitalist, and decolonial scholarship. Hasta la próxima. Gracias.